Part 2. Inside the Kingdom. Chapter 5. Faith, Works, and Salvation. It is one thing to believe the basic Christian claims and quite another to know what to do with that belief. At the end of my path to elementary faith was a brand new trailhead into the world of Christianity, a vibrant, ancient world populated with a diverse host of guides and mentors. First century Jewish martyrs had much to teach, as did 5th century Benedictine monks, 13th century philosophers, 20th century literature professors, and countless in between. The greatest guide was, of course, Christ himself, and his words were not to be taken lightly. No one in all the Bible spoke more about hell than Jesus. His teachings are filled with dire warnings of destruction, of being thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, a place where the worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. He said rather vividly that it would be better to gouge out your eye or cut off one of your limbs than to find yourself in hell. Thus, my first steps out of the cool intellectual questions that led me to Jesus were not steps into some blissful state of peace and harmony. No, this was sheer terror. My already unfathomable universe had just expanded. I would lie awake trying to imagine eternity, and the impossible mental exercise filled me with dread and awe. It was a cousin of the feeling I get when I stand out under the stars and imagine gravity suddenly reversing so that I'm free falling into the vast space overhead. It was like what I would imagine feeling while on a boat out in the middle of the ocean and noticing a creature 10 times the size of my boat swimming by underneath. I perceived my dreadful smallness, and eternity was too much for me, especially with the prospect of hell coloring it. I felt that I was a decent enough person, not unusually good or bad, but what difference did that make? Jesus had been clear that it takes a lot more than simple decency to escape torment. If I took Jesus seriously, I would have to accept that a decent life by most people's standards was nowhere near enough. Jesus demanded extreme commitment. He once stood before a crowd and said, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it." I found it incredible that Jesus told a crowd in the first century that the only way to follow him was to take up their cross daily. He said this before crosses had adopted all the religious baggage they now have. To his listeners, crosses represented nothing more than a gruesome method of torture and execution. Jesus might as well have said they could not follow him unless they began each day with letting someone skin them alive. So there I stood with hell in one direction, daily torture on the other, and no possibility of middle ground. It was time to come down from the abstract imagery of crosses and gouged eyes and ask a simple question. What exactly is Jesus telling me to do? All this talk about taking up my cross was a start, but I couldn't take up my cross if I didn't know what it looked like. What did the practical day-to-day life of following Jesus entail, and why was it so brutal? My first attempt to answer this question took me to the first 4 books of the New Testament, which detail the life of Jesus, including several of his spoken instructions on the Christian lifestyle. I found perhaps the most condensed summary in Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, where he described a lifestyle so drastically different from how I had been living up to that point that reading it made me sick with dread. Jesus demanded from his followers extraordinary acts of humility, selflessness, generosity, hard work, and self-control. He demanded not only that they speak and act properly, but that they keep their very thoughts in line. He told them that if they were forced by some oppressive enemy to do some unwanted task, they should do twice as much as the oppressor asked. Indeed, his followers were instructed to love their enemies with as much open kindness as they love their friends, and in secret to take it even further and pray for those enemies. He told his followers not to worry about money, nor about securing food or clothing for themselves. If they focused on advancing his kingdom, he promised them all the food and clothing they would need. He demanded that his followers not even look at someone if their sexual desires would be aroused by looking. He warned his followers not to be angry with each other and to immediately work things out when there was an interpersonal conflict, and they had better not dare to insult or demean each other. Jesus' description of the Christian lifestyle flips the ordinary world upside down. No one behaved the way Jesus required. People were openly hateful to those with whom they disagreed on politics, let alone genuine enemies. All anyone worried about was money, and those who didn't have to worry about it simply attached their anxiety to whether they would have the social status they wanted. Dabbling in pornography was practically a rite of passage into manhood, and sex appeal was something men and women alike pursued with great effort and proudly flaunted. As for working out conflicts with gentleness, by far the most common reaction I saw to conflicts was vicious, demeaning gossip in secret. The second most common reaction was to be openly vicious and demeaning before strutting off to brag to friends about putting so and so in their place. I read the words of Jesus and saw before me an impossible task. I would have to do and become all of that to escape hell? Jesus held his followers to standards I had never seen anyone reach. Thus, at the beginning of my Christian journey, I wondered if I was already too far gone. I certainly wasn't good enough to start with, and the path to Jesus' standards looked brutally steep from where I stood. Impossible as the Christian journey appeared, I had to try. It remained ever at the forefront of my mind that if I couldn't make the climb up that towering mountain, it was hell I would tumble down into. With the enthusiasm common among New Year's resolutionists, I set out to be everything Jesus demanded. And with the willpower common among New Year's resolutionists, I quickly grew tired and failed. After each new failure, I would look back on whatever wrong I had done and promise myself never to let it happen again. Before long, I realized how laughable that promise was. Inevitably, I found myself in the grips of all the same moral vices, often worse than before. It felt as though my efforts to overcome the evil within me were only making it stronger. Eager to make progress up the mountain, I only slid deeper into the valley. Misery upon misery followed. I hadn't felt all that peaceful before, but it was far worse now that Jesus had shown me what a person can and should be, what the people in his kingdom are like. Seeing the dazzling pinnacle of the mountain overhead only increased my misery at remaining so deep in the valley. Anxiety, depression, anger, and sorrow filled my every waking moment and many of my dreams. An unquenchable fire burned in my spirit, this constant grief and horror at my separation from what Jesus wanted, separation from Jesus himself. Worse still, I was designed by God to be in a relationship with him, which meant that any sustainable joy, peace, or flourishing apart from him was impossible. I might be able to temporarily distract myself from the separation, but such distractions would ultimately fail. A car could not just decide one day to run on coffee instead of gas. It would have to run on whatever its designer created it to run on. I, a creature designed by God, would flourish only in his presence. How could I escape that burning misery when it was fueled by my own failures? If God could not tolerate the evil in me, he could simply remove me from his presence. I, on the other hand, could not escape myself. I had the weapons to end my physical life, but not my existence. All that was left for me was this constant burning misery, an unquenchable fire. Unquenchable fire. How interesting that this was the imagery that best describes the burning misery my life had become. How remarkably similar to Jesus' descriptions of hell, the place defined by its distance from God. Hell is, according to Jesus, the outer darkness, and the idea of a burning outer darkness was beginning to make sense with painful clarity. If God is the center of all existence and is the source of every pleasure existence has to offer, then heaven and hell would, at a basic level, be nothing other than nearness to and distance from him, life inside and outside his will. My life already contained the marks of hell, just as the lives of so many Christians contain the peace, joy, and love characteristic of heaven, near God. Far from arbitrary, heaven and hell were the natural, logical destinations of the only two paths a person could travel, toward or away from God. Hell began to make sense. It was not as though God sat around wondering how best to torment his creatures before deciding a giant fire pit would do the trick. Imagery has often been necessary to approximate what humanity cannot grasp, and fire works very nicely as a description of what separation from God feels like. Hell, I realized, is a natural result of human free will, which, at its core, is about choosing God or choosing to go one's own way. In a world where individual freedom ranks among the most popular aspirations, the destination of those who go their own way would be a popular one indeed. God could not yank his creatures kicking and screaming into a loving relationship with him. If they would not come to him, the only remaining option was that burning outer darkness, the worst imaginable place to be, separate from the one who both created their desires and was the only one capable of fulfilling them. Prisoners of war who spent years being tortured don't joke and laugh about the experience, and those who poke fun at the prospect of landing in hell can only do so because they don't realize how unimaginably terrible it is. Perceiving the logic of heaven and hell was good and well, but it got me no closer to actually climbing the sheer face of the mountain that led to heaven. The mountain was too hard, the valley was ablaze with hellfire, and on my own strength I could only sink deeper into the valley. No matter what the legalists, Stoics, or Nietzsche said, no one has the willpower to do all they believe they should do. We are all, every one of us, too frail. I found myself among the countless souls throughout history who have realized their hopelessness and cried out for relief from the impossible, unbearable problem oppressing them. This miserable predicament is the human predicament, or rather, it was. Good news came to me like a balm for my burning spirit. Another one of the churchy words that seems to have lost its meaning in the modern discourse is gospel, which once simply meant good news and had nothing to do with spired buildings, plaid button-ups, or conservative politics. And that good news is simply this: Jesus came to rescue us from our sins and unite us with God. In the biblical book of Romans, Paul goes into great detail to explain the gospel from start to finish, and one who wants to understand the gospel should read all of Romans, preferably with the help of a few trustworthy commentaries to make sense of the difficult concepts. John Stott and N.T. Wright have published some exceptional scholarship on Romans that is approachable for a theological layperson. Specifically, however, I found that Romans and several other New Testament books describe a situation where humanity was trapped in the miserable state I described earlier. Then Jesus arrived, lived a perfect life, allowed himself to be crucified, and rose from the dead. Now, all who see what Jesus has done and respond by trusting him are rescued from their miserable state. In the words of one New Testament writer, by his wounds you have been healed. There are all sorts of theories out there about why Jesus' death on the cross somehow rescued us and allowed us to unite with God, which is not surprising since the mechanics of that sort of transaction certainly aren't obvious on the face of it. I ran a quick internet search a moment ago and found an article outlining no fewer than 9 such theories of atonement. In my view, those theories sought answers to a headier, less practical question than what I needed answers to. Those theories set out to show how God went about saving humanity, whereas I simply wanted to know what God was saving me from, what God was saving me into, and how to gain access to that salvation. Mine were the sorts of questions one might ask when running a cost-benefit analysis, which is precisely what I was doing. Saved from. Concerning what God saved me from, it was immediately clear that he saved me from that burning valley I was previously unable to climb out of. In biblical terms, he saved me from sin. I discovered that the word sin in the Bible originally meant miss the mark. And this made sense in the world I had come to recognize, a world where heaven and hell are nothing more and nothing less than life inside and outside God's will. Hell and the sin that had led me part way into it would always miss the mark, for it would always miss God himself. Similarly, it came as no surprise that death was always the result of sin in the Bible. Cut a branch from the vine that sustains it, and that branch withers. The longer they're apart, the more complete the decay. Saved into. As for what God saved me into, it was not so clear. When Christians began describing to me the rewards of Christianity, most described leaving their bodies after death and drifting off beyond the clouds to a place with jewels, crowns, singing, and deceased loved ones now alive and well. Some even claimed that all who get in are given mansions all to themselves. The image in my mind was of something like an enormous bejeweled hospital with floors made of clouds. To be honest, it struck me as rather dull. I had yet to put it together that the God who designed every good and pleasurable experience on earth, be it tea, springtime, or romance, is the God whose presence and creativity are the central features of heaven. Further, I had yet to put it together that if I could progress into the suffering of hell on this side of death, it might likewise be possible to start down the opposite path toward the pleasures of heaven. What I discovered was that being saved from God's absence was to be saved into his presence, and his presence was not for the faint-hearted. Indeed, only the humblest of hearts would have the strength to handle it, for only the humblest hearts would invite God to replace their feeble strength with his own. All others would flee from his presence in arrogance or shame. This God was the one the Bible called a consuming fire. He was the God who could see deeper into his creatures' thoughts and intentions than they could even see into themselves. The God who refused to accept anything less than the utter annihilation of every last trace of evil within them. Not even the smallest sins would go undemolished by the consuming fire. One hoping to cling to even a small sin, a simple lie, the refusal to forgive, lustful thoughts, anything, would have to cling to it in the burning outer darkness. The consuming fire would be painful too, but that pain was not its most noticeable feature. Christian salvation, I found, is categorized into two key elements, justification and sanctification, and the rescue mission of Jesus accomplished both. Justification is what I always heard Christians talking about, the fact that despite our willful rebellion, God loved us enough to send Jesus and save us from the natural results of our actions, those results, of course, being the miseries of hell. It is incredible, no doubt, but it is only one element of salvation. What Christians mentioned far less was no less incredible, that Jesus' rescue mission launched a new era of humanity, the era of the kingdom of heaven, where God's Spirit would be poured into his people, transforming them from the inside out. And it was this inside out change, this sanctification of the whole person, that often went unmentioned when Christians talked about salvation. It also turned out to be among the most delightful and excruciating of Christian experiences. Gaining access. Concerning what it takes to gain access to Christian salvation, I said really all there is to say about it earlier with this simple phrase: all who trust Jesus are rescued from their miserable state. Indeed, it may be the most incredible thing about salvation that it has only one requirement: believing and trusting Jesus. It's what the Bible calls faith, and it is described again and again as the gateway to salvation. Dozens of questions, if not full-blown protests, are bound to arise at this point. Among the most obvious is, how can you say faith is the only requirement? Christianity has all sorts of rules. The main reason I'm comfortable saying faith is the only requirement to be saved is that the Bible repeatedly says it. For instance, take this quote from Paul's letter to the Ephesians: "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." Similarly, Paul wrote this in his letter to the Romans: "Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand." For a fuller explanation, I would point you to Romans 4, which goes into why faith, set in contrast to works, i.e., something we're capable of doing, is the door to salvation. Many at this stage will ask, then what about all the rules? Why follow them if faith is all it takes to escape hell? Why not just have faith, then go about my sinful business? The verses above said it all. Works don't save people. These questions represent an approach to Christianity called antinomianism, and after my entire intellectual journey up to that point, the idea of it struck me as absurd. One who wonders what incentive a saved Christian has to follow the rules could not have grasped what it meant to be saved in the first place. After all, these rules are not some arbitrary list crafted by God to test his followers' obedience. They are more like a description of practical ways one can embody God's personality and presence in the world around them. Living outside the rules would be to live outside of God, which is the essence of sin and its logical conclusion, hell. Asking why Christians need to follow the rules after being saved is like asking why a parent who loves his children must also refrain from eating them. One who knows what love means would never ask that ridiculous question. Similarly, God did not rescue us from sin just so we could wallow freely in it. What's the point in saving someone from a forest fire if you're just going to light them on fire yourself when you get home? Salvation empowers the Christian to escape the burning misery of sin and hell and to begin climbing that sheer mountain wall that separates us from God. Apart from the power and presence of the Spirit, this climb is impossible. By the grace of God, through faith in Jesus, that climb becomes not only possible, but inevitable. What an extraordinary victory Jesus won for us on the cross. Antinomians, on the other hand, seem to think it is possible to be saved from sin while remaining sinful, which only proves that they never actually wanted what God was offering. They only wanted safety from a poorly developed concept of hell. They never wanted God Himself. Trust God or don't, but it is senseless to claim to trust Him while ignoring everything He says, to go on shamelessly doing whatever you feel like doing, as though your desires aren't sharply opposed to God's. The fact is, our skewed desires are why we needed saving in the first place. I have found that those who truly accept God's offer to rescue them from sin quickly come to despise sin with a passion, and they hate no sin more fiercely than the sin that must be rooted out of themselves. At the opposite end of the spectrum from the antinomians are the legalists, whose approach to Christianity is no less problematic. Often grumpy, if not downright aggressive, about their beliefs, legalists have become convinced that the path to salvation is a matter of following a precise set of rules. In my experience, the set of rules emphasized by any given sect of legalists never correlates in the slightest to what God emphasizes in the Bible. For instance, I've had quite a few run-ins with a small Christian sect, one faction of which spends a great deal of time and energy defending their belief that using musical instruments during Christian worship is not merely wrong, but is a severe enough offense to damn all such worshipers to hell. On the other hand, I cannot recall ever hearing those within that same faction fighting for the dignity of the poor, or for that matter, any form of social justice. On the contrary, I've often heard them blaming the poor for their poverty and openly opposing social justice initiatives. Zero biblical passages decry musical instruments, and something like 2,000 instruct God's people to pursue justice for the poor, refugees, immigrants, widows, and orphans. Talk about missing the point. But that's the problem with legalism. It always misses the point for the simple fact that faith is the gateway to salvation, and no list of rules can be followed closely enough to earn it. When legalists become fixated on their sacred lists, they often devolve into the worst kinds of people, stubbornly refusing to grow or learn, devoid of empathy, bitter and angry, quick to condemn others. The predictably fearful and intellectually dishonest traits of those who, whether they realize it or not, believe they must secure and defend their own salvation rather than entrusting it to Jesus. Legalists tend to be pretty well versed on their points of contention with those they see as outsiders, including fellow Christians, while retaining a less than elementary understanding of the gospel itself. After a handful of immensely frustrating run-ins with legalists, I was admittedly relieved to discover that Jesus was openly harsh with the legalists of his day, most notably the Pharisees, whom he once called children of hell. He accused them of straining out a gnat only to swallow a camel, and berated them for constantly missing the point and for spending so much effort trying to look good on the outside that they never noticed their inner spirit decaying. In reply, many of today's legalists will defend their rules-based approach with a Bible verse written by James: "Faith without works is dead." James argues that faith cannot, on its own, justify the Christian before God, for even the demons believe. He even goes so far as to conclude that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. I did have to wrestle with that section of James, especially in light of the salvation by faith alone verses discussed earlier, but by now I had come to accept that Christianity would never allow me to be intellectually lazy. The Bible speaks as poorly of foolishness and laziness as any other sins, and it had taken an intellectual marathon just to reach Christianity's front gate. If I wanted to remain on the Christian journey, I would have to do the hard work of facing difficult, often scary questions and learning new things. If God's infinite wisdom was any hint at the nature of Christianity, I could expect to be expanding my finite mind to handle such questions as they arose for the rest of my life. What I unearthed from this passage in James was an inherent logic to salvation that does justice to the verses previously mentioned, while excluding both antinomianism and legalism. Consider first the verses from Paul stating that faith is the sole doorway to salvation. Consider next the assertion from James that faith without works is dead, thus showing that a person is justified by works. How can these ideas coexist? I studied a little formal logic in preparation for law school, and one of the first principles I learned was how to reverse a conditional if-then statement. For example, I can say, if I am in my bedroom, then I am in my house, which is true. If I want to reverse that statement and still be correct, I can't say, if I am in my house, then I am in my bedroom. That one isn't true. I might be in the house, but also in the cupboard under the stairs. So if I want to reverse the statement and still be correct, I have to make both the premise and conclusion negative. If I am not in my house, then I am not in my bedroom. That, once again, is true. To properly reverse a conditional if-then statement, you have to make both the premise and conclusion negative after reversing it. Now, consider the logic of faith and works. If I have faith, then I will do good works. Already I knew this to be true because of the sanctifying nature of salvation. That's why antinomianism fails. But I cannot simply reverse the statement to say, if I have works, then I have faith. That one isn't true, and the Bible is rife with examples of people who do all sorts of good works while still widely missing the mark. Instead, the appropriate parallel statement would be, if I do not do good works, then I do not have faith. This one is true. Put differently, works may not save anyone, but they remain inseparable from faith. So much for antinomianism and legalism. One cannot both trust God and ignore his guidance. Faith that doesn't produce action isn't really faith, for Christianity is an inside-out affair. And because it is an inside-out affair, a person also cannot focus on the rules to the detriment of the spirit underlying them. Another term Jesus used to describe the legalists was whitewashed tomb, clean on the outside, a rotting corpse on the inside. And those who fall into the trap of legalism will often devolve into just that. Thus, the first step into Christianity was a simple one, trusting Jesus. Faith, I had learned, truly is the gateway to salvation and to the entire renovation of the spirit that salvation entails. Prayer. My gracious God, how could you love me enough to take such extreme measures to rescue me? Compassionate, resolute Jesus, how could you willingly accept such a gruesome and torturous death on my behalf? Empowering Spirit, how can you tolerate living inside such a vile person as I am? I look to the cross and feel ashamed of my past. I look within myself and see the putrid evidence of sin still oozing from every facet of my heart. Only clothed in the goodness of Jesus can I even come to you in prayer and enjoy the comforting presence of your Spirit. Thank you for saving me. Every day I fail. I long for things I should never want. I am lazy and irresponsible with the time and resources you've given me. I hurt others without a second thought. I don't even do for my friends what you are willing to do for your enemies. Apart from you, I live daily in the throes of sin and hell. Please, Father, I ask in the name of Jesus, whose sacrifice allows me before you, that you would pour your Spirit into me. Fill me until I am overflowing with your love, peace, joy, and entire essence, for there is nothing better than life in you. Root out every last trace of sin from within me, drawing me always closer to your image, to what you had in mind when you designed me. In 1,000 lifetimes, I could never say or do enough to thank you for what you've done for me. Your unfathomable love drives me to humility, celebration, and most of all, praise. The more I come to know you, God, the more I adore you. Amen.